On the night of April 14th, 1912, George Widener hosted a dinner party in the a la carte restaurant of the RMS Titanic. Captain Edward J. Smith was the guest of honor. The table glittered with crystal and silver. George's wife Eleanor wore pearls worth $750,000. Their son Harry, 27 years old and fresh from buying rare books in London, sat beside them. They were celebrating. George's father, Peter A.B. Widener was a major shareholder in the International Mercantile Marine Company, which owned the White Star Line. The Titanic was his investment. The family had bet their reputation on this ship. Shortly before 9 p.m., Captain Smith excused himself from the dinner and returned to the bridge. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck an iceberg. By 2:20 a.m., the ship had sunk. George and Harry Widener helped Eleanor and her maid into Lifeboat 4. Then they stepped back. They knew what was coming. Both men drowned in the freezing Atlantic. Their bodies were never recovered. Back at Lynwood Hall, the Widener family's 110-room mansion in Pennsylvania, Peter A.B. Widener received the news that his son and grandson had died on a ship he'd invested in. His health collapsed. He never recovered. He died 3 years later, a broken man. And that was when the family began their slow disappearance from society. Not through bankruptcy, not through scandal, but through grief so profound it severed their connection to the world that had built their fortune. This is the story of Lynwood Hall, one of the largest private homes ever built in America, a mansion filled with Rembrandts and Titians and Raphaels, a palace that survived the Great Depression but could not survive the emotional devastation of the Titanic. By 1944, the family had abandoned it. By the late 1990s, it sat empty and decaying. And by 2003, it was on the endangered buildings list. The Widener family didn't lose their wealth. They walked away from it. Before we begin, if you enjoy deep dives into forgotten history and the dark secrets behind America's grandest estates, please subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon so you never miss a story. Now, let's step inside Lynwood Hall and discover what really happened to the family who built it. Chapter 1. The Butcher's Boy. Peter Errol Brown. Widener was born on November 13, 1834, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His parents were German immigrants. His father was a bricklayer. The family lived in a working-class neighborhood where survival meant labor and thrift. There was no indication that this boy would become one of the wealthiest men in America. No trust fund, no inheritance. No connections to Philadelphia's old money families. Just a German immigrant family trying to make it in a new country. Peter attended public school until he was 14 years old. Then he left to apprentice as a butcher. He learned to cut meat, manage inventory, deal with suppliers, handle customers. He saved every penny he could spare. At 21, Peter opened his own butcher shop in the Spring Garden Market. It was a small operation, one stall, but it became popular. Not just for the quality of the meat, but because Peter had a talent for conversation. His shop became a gathering place for local men who wanted to discuss politics, business, city affairs. Peter listened, he learned, and he made connections. Through these connections, he became the Republican leader of the 20th Ward. Politics in Philadelphia during the 1850s meant patronage, contracts, favors. Peter understood how the system worked. When the Civil War began in 1861, Peter saw an opportunity. The Union Army needed supplies, massive quantities of food for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Peter used his political connections to secure a government contract to supply mutton to all Union troops within a 10-mile radius of Philadelphia. The contract made him $50,000, a fortune in 1865 dollars, more money than most people in Philadelphia would see in a lifetime. Peter took his war profits and made a bet. He invested in streetcars. This decision changed everything. Philadelphia in the 1860s was experiencing explosive growth. The city's population had doubled in just 20 years. Factories were opening, businesses were expanding. Workers needed to get from their homes in the outskirts to jobs in the city center. The old system, walking or hiring private carriages, couldn't handle the demand. Horse-drawn streetcars existed, but they were slow, unreliable, and expensive to operate. Horses tired. They needed to be fed, stabled, replaced. The infrastructure was limited. Most lines only ran a few miles. The system couldn't scale, but Peter saw the future. He understood that whoever controlled urban transportation would control urban growth. Workers would live wherever the streetcar lines ran. Businesses would locate where customers could reach them easily. Real estate values would rise along the routes. The streetcar wasn't just transportation. It was power. Peter partnered with William Lukens Elkins. Elkins had started as a clerk in one of Peter's butcher shops. He was 15 years younger than Peter, born in 1832 in Delaware County. Elkins was brilliant with numbers, obsessed with efficiency, and shared Peter's ruthless business instinct. The two men complemented each other perfectly. Peter was the strategist, the politician, the man who understood power. Elkins was the operator, the detail-oriented manager who made things run smoothly. Together, they were unstoppable. They began by purchasing small streetcar lines in Philadelphia, lines that were failing, poorly managed, barely profitable. Widener and Elkins bought them cheap, reorganized the operations, improved service, and immediately increased revenue. Then they started consolidating. They bought competing lines and merged them. They negotiated favorable franchise agreements with the city government. Peter's political connections made this easier. They standardized fares, schedules, equipment. They turned a chaotic collection of independent operators into a unified system. The Philadelphia Traction Company was born in the 1870s. Within a decade, Widener and Elkins controlled virtually all public transportation in Philadelphia. Every worker's 5-cent fare, every family's trip to market. Every businessman's commute. All that money flowed to Widener and Elkins. The revenue was staggering. Millions of dollars per year in an era when a skilled worker might earn $500 annually. But the real wealth came from real estate. Widener and Elkins didn't just run streetcar lines. They bought land along the routes before the lines were built. Then they announced the new routes. Property values soared. They sold the land for enormous profits or developed it themselves. This strategy, buying land, building infrastructure, profiting from development, became the Widener-Elkins model. They used it again and again, in city after city. Philadelphia wasn't enough. In the 1880s, Widener and Elkins expanded to Chicago. They bought streetcar franchises, electrified the lines, consolidated operations. They did the same in New York, Baltimore, Pittsburgh. Wherever cities were growing, wherever workers needed transportation, Widener and Elkins appeared with capital and expertise. They also invested in the new electric trolley technology. Cable cars were expensive to build and maintain. Horse-drawn cars were slow, but electric streetcars powered by overhead wires, fast, efficient, scalable. Widener and Elkins pioneered their adoption in American cities. By the 1890s, Widener and Elkins controlled streetcar systems across the Northeast and Midwest. They were transportation magnates, but they understood the principle of diversification. They'd built their fortune on a single industry. Now they needed to spread the risk. Peter bought stock in United States Steel when Andrew Carnegie sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan in 1901. He invested in Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's petroleum monopoly. He purchased shares in the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the most profitable railroads in America. He acquired stakes in the American Tobacco Company, which controlled cigarette manufacturing. Peter also invested in electric utilities, coal mines, real estate companies, banks. His fortune grew exponentially. Money made more money. Investments compounded. By the 1890s, Peter A.B. Widener's wealth was estimated at over $100 million. Some said it was closer to $200 million. In today's money, that's well over $3 billion. Peter was one of the richest men in America, comparable to the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Rockefellers. But unlike those families, Peter came from nothing. He'd been a butcher's apprentice. His father was a German immigrant bricklayer. Peter had no family connections, no inherited wealth, no aristocratic lineage. Everything he'd achieved came from intelligence, ruthlessness, and perfect timing. By the 1890s, Peter A.B. Widener was one of the richest men in America. Conservative estimates put his fortune at over $100 million. Some said it was closer to $200 million. He could buy anything, go anywhere, associate with anyone. But Peter was still the butcher's son from a German immigrant family. And Philadelphia's old money families never let him forget it. They accepted his money when he donated to their charities. They attended his parties when he invited them, but they never truly accepted him as an equal. Peter decided to change that. He would prove he belonged among America's elite, and he would do it the way Gilded Age millionaires always did, through art, architecture, and spectacle. In 1858, Peter had married Hannah Josephine Dunton. They had 3 sons, Harry, who died of typhoid fever at age 11, George Dunton Widener, and Joseph Early Widener. By the 1890s, George was in his 30s, managing portions of the family business. Joseph was in his 20s, developing an interest in art collecting. The family lived in an impressive mansion at the intersection of Broad Street and Girard Avenue in Philadelphia, a 4.5-story residence designed by architect Willis G. Hale. But the mansion wasn't enough. Peter wanted something grander, something that would announce to Philadelphia and to America that the Wideners had arrived. In 1896, tragedy struck. Hannah Widener died on board the family yacht while sailing off the coast of Maine. Peter was devastated. They had been married 38 years. Grief and ambition combined. Peter made a decision. He would leave Philadelphia. He would build a country estate that would eclipse anything the old money families owned, and he would fill it with an art collection that would rival the great museums of Europe. In memory of his wife, Peter donated the family's Philadelphia mansion to the Free Library of Philadelphia. It became the Josephine Widener Memorial Branch of the Free Library, a public institution bearing his wife's name. Then Peter turned his attention to Elkins Park, a suburb of Philadelphia where he'd already purchased a summer property called Lynwood Hall. He decided to demolish Lynwood and build something far more ambitious. In 1897, Peter hired Horace Trumbauer. Trumbauer was only 29 years old, but he'd already designed gray towers for the Harrison family in Glenside, and Peter had been impressed. Trumbauer understood what wealthy clients wanted: European grandeur adapted to American sensibilities, buildings that looked like they'd stood for centuries but included modern conveniences, mansions that announced status through scale and classical proportions. Peter gave Trumbauer a challenging brief. The new house needed to accommodate Peter himself, plus both of his sons and their families. It needed galleries for a growing art collection. It needed a ballroom large enough for 1,000 guests. It needed to be a working estate, virtually self-sustaining, and it needed to make a statement. Trumbauer designed Lynwood Hall. The mansion would be built of Indiana limestone in the neoclassical revival style, T-shaped, 268 feet long by 215 feet deep. 110 rooms total, including 55 bedrooms. A ballroom measuring 2,550 square feet, with ceilings transported from a 16th-century European chateau. An art gallery on the main floor with innovative lighting systems using diffused skylights and adjustable fins. The estate would encompass 300 acres. 33 of those acres would be fenced ornamental gardens designed by landscape architect Jacques Graber. There would be a power plant, water pumps, a laundry, a carpentry shop, a bakery, a farm with greenhouses, stock barns, chicken houses, a half-mile racetrack with a polo field in the middle. Stables for thoroughbred horses. Construction began in 1897. 2 years later, on December 19, 1899, Lynwood Hall opened with a gala. 400 guests attended. The New York Symphony performed. Soprano Johanna Gadsky sang. Philadelphia society was forced to acknowledge what Peter Widener had built. It wasn't just a mansion. It was a palace, the second largest surviving Gilded Age estate in America. Peter had won, or so it seemed. Chapter 2. The Art Collection. When Peter A.B. Widener moved into Lynwood Hall in 1900, he brought more than his family. He brought one of the most significant private art collections in American history. Peter had been collecting art since the 1880s. But his approach intensified after he built Lynwood Hall. The mansion's galleries demanded masterpieces, and Peter had the money to acquire them. He wasn't collecting for investment purposes, though the art did appreciate dramatically in value. He wasn't trying to impress visitors with famous names, though the collection certainly impressed everyone who saw it. Peter genuinely loved art. He studied it obsessively. He spent hours in the galleries at Lynwood Hall, examining paintings, discussing them with experts, learning about techniques, histories, meanings. His collecting focused on old masters, Italian Renaissance paintings, Dutch Golden Age works, English portraiture, Flemish still lifes. Peter wanted art from established masters whose reputations were unassailable. He wasn't interested in contemporary art or experimental works. He wanted paintings that had stood the test of centuries. Peter's approach to collecting was methodical. He worked with dealers in London, Paris, Rome, Amsterdam. He studied auction catalogs. He read art history books and consulted with museum directors. When a significant work came on the market, Peter was often the first to know. He paid top dollar. Peter believed that great art was worth whatever it cost. When he wanted a painting, he made an offer that couldn't be refused. Dealers learned that if Peter Widener was interested, they should name their highest price immediately. Bargaining was pointless. This reputation had consequences. Sellers inflated prices when the Wideners expressed interest. Other collectors competed with them for major works, driving prices even higher. But Peter almost always got what he wanted. Money in sufficient quantities overcomes most obstacles. The collection eventually included 14 paintings by Rembrandt van Rijn, the Dutch master of the 17th century. 14 Rembrandts in a private collection was extraordinary. Only Buckingham Palace had more. Among Peter's Rembrandts was The Mill, depicting a windmill on a hill at sunset, considered one of the master's finest landscapes. There was, quote, one showing Rembrandt's genius for portraiture and psychological depth. Each painting was a museum-quality work that scholars traveled from Europe to study. Peter owned Johannes Vermeer's, quote, two, one of only 34 known paintings by the Dutch master. Vermeer's work was exceptionally rare. He produced fewer than 50 paintings during his lifetime. Woman Weighing Gold showed a woman standing at a table holding a balance, illuminated by window light. The painting was perfect, quiet, contemplative, a masterpiece of light and composition. Peter acquired a Raphael Madonna, one of the few authentic Raphaels in America at the time. Raphael's paintings of the Madonna and Child were among the most revered works of the Italian Renaissance. Most remained in European churches and museums. For Peter to own one was a statement of his collection's significance. There were paintings by Anthony van Dyck, the Flemish Baroque painter who'd been court painter to King Charles I of England. Van Dyck's portraits of aristocrats were elegant, sophisticated, magnificent. Peter owned several, including portraits that had once hung in English manor houses. Peter owned works by Titian, the great Venetian master of the 16th century. Titian's use of color, his ability to capture flesh tones and fabrics, made him one of the most influential painters in history. Peter's Titian paintings showed biblical and mythological scenes rendered with dramatic power. There were paintings by El Greco, the Greek painter who'd worked in Spain and developed a distinctive, almost mystical style. By Diego Velázquez, the Spanish court painter whose technical brilliance rivaled any artist in history. By Frans Hals, the Dutch portraitist known for capturing spontaneous expressions and lively personalities. Peter acquired Renaissance bronzes by Donatello, the Florentine sculptor who'd revolutionized sculpture in the 15th century. He owned works by Benvenuto Cellini, the Italian goldsmith and sculptor whose autobiography was as famous as his art. These weren't small decorative pieces. These were significant sculptures that museums would covet. The collection included tapestries from French chateaux woven in the 16th and 17th centuries. These massive textile artworks depicted biblical scenes, mythological stories, hunting expeditions. They'd once hung in palaces. Now they hung at Lynwood Hall. Peter collected Chinese porcelain from the Ming and Qing dynasties, blue and white ceramics, famille rose vases, imperial pieces that had been commissioned for Chinese emperors. These weren't curiosities. These were masterworks of ceramic art, valued as highly as any painting. He acquired furniture from Louis XV's palace at Versailles. Chairs, tables, cabinets, each piece was documented, authenticated, significant. When visitors sat in Lynwood Hall's reception rooms, they were literally sitting on furniture that French royalty had used. Peter installed Persian rugs throughout the mansion, not ordinary rugs, but antique carpets from Isfahan, Tabriz, Kerman. Silk rugs with thousands of knots per square inch, carpets that had taken years to weave, works of art that happened to cover floors. The art gallery at Lynwood Hall was designed specifically to display this collection. Horace Trumbauer, the architect, worked with Peter to create an innovative lighting system. Natural light came through diffused skylights. Adjustable fins directed sunlight precisely onto the paintings, without causing glare or damage. The system allowed visitors to see the paintings in ideal lighting conditions, while protecting them from harmful UV exposure. Peter also had a hidden safe room installed behind the butler's pantry. The room wasn't shown on the blueprints. Inside were 14 velvet-lined safes. What Peter stored there remains unknown. Jewelry, documents, additional small artworks? No one knows. But the existence of the secret room suggests Peter understood the value and the vulnerability of his possessions. Peter's younger son, Joseph Early Widener, shared his father's passion for art. As Joseph grew older, he became increasingly involved in managing and expanding the collection. Joseph had an even more refined eye than his father. He studied art history formally. He corresponded with scholars. He understood not just what was valuable, but why it was valuable. Father and son traveled to Europe together multiple times, visiting dealers, attending auctions, examining paintings in private collections and museums. They were known in European art circles as serious collectors who understood quality and were willing to pay for it. This collecting frenzy had a purpose beyond personal enjoyment. Peter was building cultural capital. In the Gilded Age, newly wealthy industrialists faced a problem: how to distinguish themselves from mere millionaires. Anyone could have money, but not everyone could assemble a collection that rivaled European aristocracy. The Vanderbilts built mansions. The Carnegies funded libraries. The Morgans collected manuscripts. Each family found their way to demonstrate that their wealth was more than vulgar accumulation. It was cultivation, sophistication, a contribution to civilization. Peter chose art, and by choosing the finest art, by assembling one of the great private collections in America, Peter proved he belonged among cultural elites. Museum directors courted him. Art historians consulted him. European aristocrats opened their homes to him because he possessed something they couldn't buy: an eye for quality and the resources to acquire it. The art collection gave Peter something his streetcar fortune could not: legitimacy, respectability, a legacy that would outlive him. Peter knew he would die. The fortune might be spent, the mansion might crumble, but great art endures, and if his name was attached to that art, his memory would endure too. By the time Lynwood Hall opened in 1899, Peter's collection was valued at approximately $5 million. In today's money, that's over $150 million. And that was just the beginning. Peter would continue collecting for another 15 years. Chapter 3. The Titanic Investment. In 1902, J.P. Morgan, one of the most powerful financiers in the world, created the International Mercantile Marine Company. IMM was a trust designed to monopolize transatlantic shipping. Morgan bought the White Star Line, the American Line, the Red Star Line, and others. He controlled the majority of passenger and cargo ships traveling between America and Europe. Peter A.B. Widener was one of Morgan's partners. Through the Fidelity Trust Company of Philadelphia, which Peter controlled, he became a major shareholder in IMM. This investment seemed brilliant. Transatlantic travel was booming. Millions of immigrants were crossing from Europe to America. Wealthy Americans were traveling to Europe for business and pleasure. The demand for ship passages was insatiable. And then the White Star Line announced plans to build 3 new luxury liners: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. These ships would be the largest, most luxurious vessels ever constructed. They would attract first-class passengers willing to pay premium fares. The Titanic, in particular, was marketed as unsinkable. Advanced safety features, watertight compartments, superior construction. Nothing could go wrong. Peter's investment looked even better. He would profit from every ticket sold on the Titanic. His shareholding in IMM meant he had a stake in the ship's success. By 1912, Peter's older son George had become deeply involved in the family business. George, born in 1861, was 50 years old. He'd married Eleanor Elkins, daughter of Peter's business partner William Elkins, in 1883. They had 3 children: Harry Elkins Widener, George Dunton Widener Jr., and Eleanor Elkins Widener. George ran the Philadelphia Traction Company, managing the streetcar operations his father had built. He served on the boards of multiple companies. He was a senior warden at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Elkins Park. He was a prominent figure in Philadelphia society. George's eldest son, Harry, had graduated from Harvard in 1907. At 27 years old, Harry was a passionate bibliophile. He collected rare books with the same intensity his grandfather collected paintings. Harry's collection included over 3,000 volumes, a Gutenberg Bible, Shakespeare folios, first editions of important works. For Harry, books weren't investments. They were treasures. In March 1912, George, Eleanor, and Harry traveled to Europe. Officially, they were on multiple errands. George owned the Philadelphia Ritz-Carlton Hotel and wanted to hire a French chef. Eleanor needed to purchase a wedding dress in Paris for their daughter Eleanor, who was engaged to Fitz Eugene Dixon. Harry wanted to buy rare books in London, but there was a personal element to the trip. They were the Wideners. They traveled to Europe regularly. They stayed at the finest hotels. They dined with aristocrats. This was how wealthy Americans lived during the Gilded Age. In Paris, Harry acquired several rare books, including a second edition of Francis Bacon's Essays. It was the kind of find that thrilled him, a piece of literary history he could add to his collection. When it came time to return to America, they booked passage on the Titanic. First-class tickets, the best accommodations on the most luxurious ship in the world. George's father, Peter A.B. Widener, was a major investor in the ship. It was a point of family pride. Of course, the Wideners would travel on the Titanic. On April 10, 1912, George, Eleanor, and Harry boarded the ship at Cherbourg, France. They brought 2 servants, George's valet Edwin Herbert Keeping and Eleanor's maid Amelie Giger. They were assigned cabins C-80 and C-82, among the finest on the ship. 4 days later, on the evening of April 14th, George and Eleanor hosted a dinner party in the Titanic's a la carte restaurant. Captain Edward J. Smith was the guest of honor. Other guests included John B. Thayer and his wife Marion, Major Archibald Butt, William Carter and his wife Lucille, and Clarence Moore. Eleanor wore her famous pearl necklace, valued at $750,000. The dinner was elegant, refined, a showcase of Gilded Age sophistication. Earlier that afternoon, George and Eleanor had been standing on the promenade deck talking with J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, when Captain Smith passed by. Without comment, Smith handed Ismay an ice warning from the White Star liner Baltic. Ismay read it and put it in his pocket. Then he went below deck. No one discussed the warning at dinner. The conversation was about other matters. Around 9 p.m., Captain Smith excused himself and returned to the bridge. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck an iceberg. Chapter 4. The Sinking. The dinner party on the evening of April 14th, 1912, was everything a Gilded Age social event should be. The a la carte restaurant on the Titanic was one of the ship's most exclusive spaces, not part of the standard first-class dining room. It required reservations and charged premium prices. Only the wealthiest passengers could afford to dine there regularly. George and Eleanor Widener had reserved a large table. Captain Edward J. Smith was the guest of honor, a deliberate choice. George's father, Peter, was a major shareholder in the International Mercantile Marine Company, which owned the White Star Line. Captain Smith commanded the White Star Line's flagship. The dinner was both social and business, a celebration of the ship and an acknowledgement of the Widener's stake in its success. The other guests reflected Philadelphia and New York's elite. John B. Thayer was second vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. His wife Marion came from a prominent banking family. Major Archibald Butt was President William Howard Taft's military aide. William Carter was a wealthy coal magnate. His wife Lucille was known for her fashion sense. Clarence Moore was a prominent horseman and businessman. Harry Widener sat at the table, 27 years old, fresh from his success purchasing rare books in London. He carried with him a second edition of Francis Bacon's Illegal 1.5 Passionchat, a volume he'd acquired from a London bookseller. He'd told friends he planned to sleep with it under his pillow every night until he got home. So valuable was the find. Eleanor wore her famous pearls, 3 strands valued at $750,000. George had given them to her for Christmas in 1909. They were among the most valuable pieces of jewelry on the ship. The dinner began around 8 p.m. Multiple courses, fine wines. The restaurant's orchestra played in the corridor outside. Conversation ranged across business, politics, society, gossip. There was laughter. The atmosphere was relaxed, celebratory. Captain Smith joined around 8:30 p.m. He was in high spirits. This was the Titanic's maiden voyage, and it was going splendidly. The ship was making excellent time. The weather was calm. Everything was perfect. Around 9 p.m., Captain Smith excused himself. He mentioned needing to return to the bridge. It was a polite departure. No one thought anything of it. Ship's captains had duties. He'd done his social obligation. The dinner continued. After the women retired to their cabins around 10 p.m., the men moved to the first-class smoking room. This was standard practice. Gentlemen would smoke cigars, drink brandy, discuss business matters without the ladies present. George, Harry, John Thayer, Major Butt, and others settled into leather chairs. The smoking room was paneled in mahogany, with stained glass windows depicting landscapes. It was comfortable, masculine, exclusive. They were still there at 11:40 p.m. when the collision occurred. The impact wasn't violent. Many passengers later described it as a slight jar, a grinding sensation, nothing that suggested catastrophe. Some passengers in their cabins didn't even feel it. Those who did assumed the ship had hit a wave or perhaps scraped against something in the dark. In the smoking room, the men felt the ship shudder. Conversation stopped briefly. Then someone made a joke about hitting an iceberg. Everyone laughed. The Titanic was unsinkable. Everyone knew that. The watertight compartments, the advanced engineering. This ship couldn't sink. But within minutes, the reality became clear. Crew members appeared moving through the ship's public spaces. They were calm but insistent. All passengers should put on life jackets and proceed to the boat deck. It was a precaution, nothing to worry about. George and Harry left the smoking room. They went to Eleanor's cabin. She was already dressed, having been awakened by the impact. Her maid Amelie was with her. George explained what the crew had said. Life jackets, boat deck, precaution. They made their way up. The grand staircase was crowded now. Other first-class passengers, many in evening clothes, moving upward. The atmosphere was still calm. No screaming, no pushing. People were confused more than frightened. On the boat deck, the situation became clearer. The ship's bow was noticeably lower in the water. The forward deck, which should have been level, was tilted, and crew members were preparing lifeboats, swinging them out on davits, removing covers, readying them for loading. This wasn't a precaution. This was an evacuation. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was in charge of loading boats on the port side. He was following the protocol strictly, women and children first. No men would be allowed in the boats until all women and children were safe. But many passengers didn't want to get in. The night was freezing. The ocean looked black and terrifying. The lifeboats seemed small and flimsy compared to the massive Titanic. Surely it was safer to stay on the ship. Crew members had to persuade people, cajoled them, sometimes physically helped reluctant passengers into the boats. The first boats left the ship half empty because people refused to board. Eleanor and her maid Amelie were directed to Lifeboat 4. It was being loaded from a deck, one level below the boat deck. They had to climb down a ladder. George and Harry helped them. George held Eleanor's hand as she stepped onto the ladder. Harry steadied Amelie. The boat was filling slowly. Marion Thayer was there. Madeline Astor, barely 19 years old and pregnant, was helped in by her husband John Jacob Astor, who asked if he could accompany her. Lightoller refused. Women and children only. Astor stepped back without argument. When Eleanor and Amelie were seated in the lifeboat, George and Harry stood at the rail above them. For a moment, they all looked at each other. Eleanor later said she knew in that instant she would never see her husband and son again. The knowledge was absolute, devastating. But there was no time for extended goodbyes. The boat was being lowered. Eleanor watched them disappear above her as the boat descended. George in his evening clothes, Harry standing beside him, both calm. Both accepting what was coming. Lifeboat 4 was lowered at approximately 1:55 a.m. By that time, the Titanic's bow was deep underwater. The forward deck was submerged. The ship was tilting at an angle that made standing difficult. Everyone could see it was doomed. In the boat, Eleanor and the other passengers sat in silence as they were rowed away from the dying ship. Behind them, the Titanic's lights blazed. The ship looked like a floating city in the darkness, but it was sinking. On board, George and Harry moved back from the rail. There was no point watching the lifeboats disappear into darkness. They walked together to the aft part of the ship, where other men who'd been left behind were gathering. Colonel Archibald Gracie saw George Widener standing with John B. Thayer. Both men were quiet. They weren't panicking. They weren't trying to force their way onto boats. They'd accepted their fate with the dignity expected of men of their class. The ship's tilt increased. Water was pouring into the forward compartments. The bow went under. The stern rose higher. People started sliding down the decks. Now, finally, there was panic, screaming, chaos. Everyone realized that the ship was about to go under. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's stern lifted almost vertically out of the water. For a moment, the ship stood on end. Then it slid beneath the surface. 1,500 people went into the water. The ocean was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Freezing. Those who didn't drown in the initial suction died of hypothermia within minutes. Their bodies went rigid. Hearts stopped. They sank into the black depths. George Dunton Widener died somewhere in that chaos. Did he jump? Did he go down with the ship? Did he drown in the final moments as water rushed through the corridors? No one knows. His body was never recovered. Harry Elkins Widener, 27 years old, bibliophile, Harvard graduate, died with his father. His rare books, including the Bacon volume he'd planned to sleep with under his pillow, went down with the ship. His body, too, was never found. Their valet, Edwin Herbert Keeping, age 33, also died. His body was one of the few recovered by the Mackay Bennett. He was buried at sea on April 21, 1912. In Lifeboat 4, Eleanor Widener sat among other survivors, waiting for rescue. Around her, women sobbed for lost husbands, lost sons, lost fathers. The night was bitterly cold. The stars were brilliant, and in the distance where the Titanic had been, there was only darkness and the sound of people dying in the water. The Carpathia arrived around 4 a.m. Lifeboats were brought alongside. Survivors climbed rope ladders to the deck. Eleanor, wrapped in blankets, was taken to a cabin. She was in shock. She didn't speak for hours. The Carpathia reached New York on April 18, 1912. Crowds waited on the docks. Reporters shouted questions. Photographers took pictures. Eleanor, still wearing the pearls that had survived the sinking, was escorted to a private train by White Star Line officials. The train took her to Philadelphia. At 30th Street Station, her surviving children waited. George Jr., 23 years old, and Eleanor, 21. They'd received telegrams. They knew their father and brother were dead, and Eleanor had to go to Lynwood Hall and tell Peter A.B. Widener that his son and grandson had drowned on a ship Peter had invested in, that his money, his business acumen, his partnership with J.P. Morgan, all of it had killed his family. Chapter 5. The Breaking Peter Bay. A.B. Widener received the news at Lynwood Hall. His son George was dead. His grandson Harry was dead. Both had drowned on the Titanic, a ship Peter had helped finance. The irony was unbearable. Peter's wealth had come from calculated risks, from seeing opportunities others missed, from betting on innovations others feared. He'd invested in streetcars when others thought they'd never replace horses. He'd bet on electric power when others thought it was dangerous. He'd consolidated transit companies when others thought competition was better. Every risk had paid off. The Titanic had seemed like another brilliant investment. J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company would monopolize transatlantic shipping. The Titanic, the Olympic, the Britannic, these ships represented the future of ocean travel. Luxurious, fast, safe. The Titanic was literally marketed as unsinkable. Advanced engineering, watertight compartments, multiple safety systems. The best minds in naval architecture had designed it. Instead, it had killed his family. Peter was 77 years old. His health had been declining. That was inevitable at his age. But he was still mentally sharp, still active in business affairs, still involved in managing the family fortune. The news of the Titanic destroyed him instantly. Friends who saw him in the days after reported that Peter aged overnight. The vitality that had driven him for 7 decades drained away. His face became gray. His posture slumped. He became withdrawn, barely speaking. Lynwood Hall, which had been built as a celebration of the Widener family's success, became a mausoleum before anyone died there. The galleries full of Rembrandts and Raphaels felt empty. The ballroom designed for 1,000 guests stood silent, the chandeliers dark. The 110 rooms echoed with absence. Every corridor, every chamber reminded Peter of what he'd lost. George had walked these halls. George had sat in the dining room discussing business with his father. George had entertained guests in the reception rooms. George's laughter had echoed through these spaces. Now there was only silence. Harry had grown up here. Harry had run through these corridors as a child. Harry had studied in the library. Harry's bedroom was on the 2nd floor, still furnished, still containing his childhood possessions. Harry's book collection, 3,000 volumes he'd assembled with such passion, sat in cases throughout the house. Every book was a reminder that Harry would never add another volume, never sit reading in his favorite chair, never discuss literature with the scholars who'd admired his collection. Eleanor Widener, George's widow, came to live at Lynwood Hall with her 2 surviving children. George Dunton Widener Jr. was 23 years old, suddenly thrust into managing portions of the family business his father had overseen. Eleanor Elkins Widener, 21 years old, was engaged to Fitz Eugene Dixon. Her wedding dress, purchased in Paris, was at the bottom of the Atlantic with her father and brother. The family tried to maintain normalcy, but how could they? The staff continued their duties, cleaning, cooking, maintaining the gardens, but the atmosphere was oppressive. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a memorial to tragedy. There had been a grand wedding planned at Lynwood Hall. Eleanor Dixon's marriage to Fitz Eugene Dixon was supposed to be the social event of the season. Hundreds of guests, an elaborate reception, dancing in the ballroom, celebrations extending across multiple days. It would have been a demonstration of the Widener family's position in society, a joyous occasion marking the next generation coming of age. Instead, the wedding was held quietly on June 20th, 1912, just 2 months after the Titanic sank. A small ceremony, immediate family only, no celebration, no joy. Eleanor Dixon wore a simple dress. Her Paris gown was lost. She married at Lynwood Hall. But it felt wrong. Her father should have been there to give her away. Her brother should have been there as a witness. Instead, her surviving brother George Jr. and her grieving grandfather Peter stood in for the dead. Peter A.B. Widener threw himself into memorializing George and Harry. It was the only thing that gave his life purpose. He couldn't bring them back, but he could ensure they were remembered. Peter worked with Eleanor Widener to establish the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library at Harvard University, Harry's alma mater. Harvard had been central to Harry's identity. He'd graduated in 1907, He'd developed his passion for rare books while at Harvard, researching costume books in the library. His happiest years had been spent in Cambridge. Eleanor donated Harry's entire collection, 3,000 volumes, including the Gutenberg Bible, Shakespeare folios, and countless rare first editions. She also provided $2 million to build a library to house them. $2 million in 1915 money was extraordinary, equivalent to over $50 million today. The Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library opened in 1915. It was designed in the neoclassical style, with massive columns and a grand entrance. Inside, a memorial room displayed Harry's collection behind glass. His name was carved in stone. The library would become one of the largest university libraries in the world, eventually housing millions of volumes. Harvard stipulated that students must pass a swimming test to graduate. A myth says this was a condition of Eleanor's donation to prevent future drownings. The story isn't true, but it persists. What is true is that Harry's name and his passion for books would be remembered at Harvard forever. Peter also worked on memorializing George. St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Elkins Park, where George had served as senior warden, needed renovation. Peter funded an extensive rebuilding. The interior was transformed into Gothic Revival style. 2 Tiffany stained glass windows were installed, one for George, one for Harry. The windows depicted religious scenes but were dedicated to the Widener men lost on the Titanic. The church became another memorial, another place where George and Harry's names would endure. Sunday services included prayers for the dead. The windows caught sunlight and glowed with colored light. Peter attended services regularly, sitting in the pew where George used to sit, looking at the windows that bore his name. Peter also established the Widener Memorial Home for crippled children in memory of his late wife Hannah. After the Titanic, he added a building to the home in George's honor. Charitable giving became Peter's way of transforming wealth into memory. If he couldn't have his family, at least he could ensure institutions bearing their names would survive. But these projects couldn't heal Peter's grief. His health continued declining. By 1914, he was largely confined to Lynwood Hall. He spent less time on business, more time in the galleries looking at the paintings he'd collected. The art that had once given him pride now seemed hollow. What good were Rembrandts when his son and grandson were dead? Peter spent summers on his yacht, avoiding Lynwood Hall when possible. The yacht, another symbol of wealth, took him to Newport, Rhode Island, where other family members would visit. But even at sea, Peter couldn't escape. The ocean had killed George and Harry. Every wave, every horizon reminded him of the Atlantic where they'd drowned. Joseph Early Widener, Peter's surviving son, became the operational head of the family business. Joseph was 41 years old in 1912. He'd been involved in family affairs for years, but now everything fell on him. Peter was incapacitated by grief. George Jr. was too young and inexperienced. Joseph had to manage the streetcar companies, the investments, the real estate, the art collection, the estate, everything. Joseph understood his father's condition. He'd lost his brother and his nephew, but Joseph had to function. The family business couldn't collapse because of personal tragedy. Employees depended on the Wideners. Stockholders expected returns. The fortune had to be preserved. Joseph managed brilliantly. He kept the business running. He made decisions Peter couldn't make. He interfaced with partners and competitors. He ensured the family's financial position remained strong. But he also watched his father deteriorate, powerless to help. On November 6, 1915, Peter Errol Brown Widener died at Lynwood Hall. He was 80 years old. His death certificate listed natural causes, but everyone knew the truth. The Titanic had killed him as surely as it had killed George and Harry. Peter had survived 3 years longer, but he'd been dead since April 15, 1912. Peter's body was placed on a bier in the Van Dyck Gallery at Lynwood Hall, below his portrait painted by John Singer Sargent. The painting showed Peter in his prime, confident, powerful, successful. The body on the bier was a shell. The man in the painting had died when his son drowned. Hundreds of people filed past to pay their respects. Employees from the streetcar companies, business associates, Philadelphia Society, art dealers from Europe, museum directors. Everyone who'd known Peter came to acknowledge his passing, but the true mourning had happened 3 years earlier. This was just making it official. The funeral was held at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, the church Peter had rebuilt in memory of George. Reverend Howell presided. The Tiffany windows caught afternoon light. George's window, Harry's window. Now Peter would join them in death, if not in body. Peter was interred in the Widener family mausoleum at Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. His wife Hannah was already there, having died in 1896. Cenotaphs for George and Harry were added, symbolic markers for men whose bodies had never been recovered from the Atlantic. The mausoleum was built of granite, imposing, permanent. The Widener name carved in stone. Joseph Early Widener inherited everything: Lynwood Hall and its contents, the art collection, the streetcar companies, the investments, the real estate, the thoroughbred horses. A fortune estimated at $60 million, over $1 billion in today's money. But Joseph also inherited the grief, the obligation, the burden of preserving what his father had built, and he would spend the next 28 years trying to hold it all together, knowing that the world his father had created was already dying. Chapter 6. The Survivor. Eleanor Elkins Widener survived the Titanic. But she could not remain at Lynwood Hall. The mansion held too many memories. Her husband had lived there. Her son Harry had grown up there. Every room reminded her of what she'd lost. Eleanor channeled her grief into memorials. She donated Harry's book collection and $2 million to Harvard to build the Widener Library. She funded the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Science Building at the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, where Harry had attended. She renovated St. Paul's Church in memory of George. But eventually Eleanor needed to move forward. She couldn't spend the rest of her life mourning. In June 1915, Eleanor attended the dedication ceremony for the Widener Library at Harvard. On the dais that day was Dr. Alexander Hamilton Rice, Jr., a Harvard-educated physician and explorer. Rice was 40 years old, known for his expeditions to the Amazon and his work in geographical exploration. Eleanor and Rice spoke. There was an immediate connection. Rice was intelligent, cultured, adventurous. He represented everything Eleanor's life had not been for the past 3 years. Rumors of an engagement surfaced in August 1915, though both Eleanor and Rice denied them. But on October 6, 1915, they married quietly in a private ceremony at Emmanuel Church on Newbury Street in Boston. Only a dozen close family and friends attended. Eleanor wore a string of pearls she had saved from the Titanic. The marriage scandalized some members of Philadelphia society. Eleanor was only 54 years old. She was remarrying just 3 years after her husband's death. Some considered it unseemly, but Eleanor didn't care what Philadelphia society thought. She'd spent 30 years fulfilling the expectations of others. Now she would live for herself. Dr. Rice continued his exploration work, and Eleanor accompanied him. They traveled to the Amazon, Europe, India. Eleanor, who had spent most of her life in Philadelphia drawing rooms and Newport cottages, now found herself in the Brazilian jungle, warding off attacks, navigating rivers. In 1920, during an expedition on the Amazon, their party was attacked. According to reports, 2 attackers were killed. Eleanor remained on the yacht during the incident, but she was there. She was part of the adventure. Eleanor and Dr. Rice maintained multiple residences: apartments in Paris, a home in New York, a mansion called Miramar in Newport that Eleanor had built as a memorial to George and Harry. They divided their time between these places, living a cosmopolitan life, far from the subdued mourning that had defined Eleanor's first years after the Titanic. Eleanor's surviving children thrived. George Dunton Widener, Jr., who had been 23 when his father and brother died, became one of America's most successful thoroughbred horse breeders. He purchased Erdenheim Farm and established himself as a major figure in horse racing. He would eventually be named an exemplar of racing by the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame, one of only 5 people ever to receive that honor. Eleanor's daughter, also named Eleanor, remained married to Fitz Eugene Dixon, They built Roneil Manor, a 60-room Tudor revival mansion in Elkins Park designed by Horace Trumbauer. The estate was less palatial than Lynwood Hall, but still magnificent. Eleanor Dixon had two children, Eleanor Widener Dixon and Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr. The Widener family was rebuilding, not at Lynwood Hall, which now belonged to Joseph and his family, but in their own separate lives. On July 13, 1937, Eleanor Elkins Widener Rice died suddenly of a heart attack while shopping in a Paris store. She was 75 years old. Her body was returned to Philadelphia and interred in the Widener family mausoleum at Laurel Hill Cemetery. She had survived the Titanic by 25 years. She had built memorials to her husband and son. She had remarried and lived a life of adventure, and she had ensured that her surviving children prospered. But she never returned to Lynwood Hall. Chapter 7. The Last Custodian. Joseph Early Widener inherited Lynwood Hall in 1915 when his father died. He was 44 years old. He'd been managing the family's business interests for years, but now he was the sole custodian of everything his father had built. Joseph understood the responsibility. The art collection at Lynwood Hall represented decades of careful acquisition. The estate itself was a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture. Joseph's job was to preserve it. Joseph was married to Ella Pancoast, a Philadelphia socialite. They had two children, Peter Errol, Brown Widener II, born in 1895, and Josephine Fifi Widener, born later. The family lived in apartments within Lynwood Hall, just as George's family had when Peter was alive. Joseph continued his father's tradition of art collecting, but with even more refined taste. He believed in quality over quantity. He sold some of Peter's lesser acquisitions and used the proceeds to buy masterpieces. Joseph's additions to the collection included works by Degas, Monet, and other Impressionists. The Widener art collection became known as one of the finest private collections in the world. Museum directors coveted it. Art historians studied it. Wealthy collectors tried to buy pieces from it, but Joseph refused to sell the important works. This was his father's legacy. His job was to protect it. Joseph also expanded the Lynwood Hall estate. In 1915, he purchased the adjoining 380 acres where Ogant's, the former estate of financier J. Cook, had stood. Joseph demolished the old Ogant's mansion and gifted 114 acres to his niece Eleanor Dixon, who would later build Roneil Manor there. Joseph used portions of the acquired land to pursue his passion for thoroughbred horses. He established breeding facilities, built stables, and imported champion horses from Europe. Like his nephew George Jr., Joseph became a significant figure in American horse racing. He eventually became president of Belmont Park Racetrack and built Hialeah Park Racetrack in Miami. Joseph's son, Peter A.B. Widener II, grew up at Lynwood Hall. He attended St. Mark's School in Massachusetts and then Harvard. When World War I began, Peter II enlisted in the U.S. Army despite physical disqualifications, including flat feet and a heart condition. His father persuaded the Surgeon General to allow his admission. Peter II served in France with a medical unit, tending to wounded soldiers and serving as an interpreter due to his fluency in French. Peter II returned from the war changed. He had seen the carnage of modern combat. He had witnessed the collapse of the old European order. The certainties of his privileged upbringing no longer seemed certain. In 1924, Peter II married Gertrude Douglas Peabody. Joseph converted the stables at Lynwood Hall into a home for his son and new daughter-in-law. They lived there, part of the Lynwood estate, hosting visiting European royalty who came to view the Widener art collection. But Peter II knew the era was ending. He could see it. The Gilded Age was over. The enormous private estates built by his grandfather's generation were becoming impossible to maintain. Taxes were rising. Servants were becoming harder to find and more expensive to employ. The social structures that had supported places like Lynwood Hall were collapsing. In 1940, Peter II published an autobiography titled Without Drums. In the book, he described his privileged upbringing at Lynwood Hall. He wrote about the art collection, the European travels, the elaborate social events, but he also wrote about the hollowness of it all. He referred to Lynwood Hall as a mausoleum. One passage became particularly famous. "The days of America's privately owned treasure houses are over. They are gone with the wind. Lynwood Hall can, I suppose, be called the last of the American Versailles." Peter II understood what was coming. The question was, what would happen to the art collection? In 1942, Joseph Early Widener announced that the family's art collection would be donated to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., not sold, not divided among the family, donated, given to the American people. The art world was stunned. The Widener collection was valued at up to $50 million, hundreds of millions in today's money, and Joseph was giving it away. But Joseph understood his father's vision. Peter A.B. Widener had been a custodian of great art. His job was to preserve it and pass it on. Joseph was fulfilling that responsibility. The announcement was made through Peter II's book. The timing was strategic. World War II was raging. The future was uncertain. Joseph wanted to ensure the collection survived, regardless of what happened to the Widener family. On October 26, 1943, Joseph Early Widener died at Lynwood Hall. He was 72 years old. He had managed the estate for 28 years, preserving it through the Great Depression when many other grand estates were demolished or sold off. Joseph was interred in the Widener family mausoleum at Laurel Hill Cemetery. His death marked the end of an era. Peter A.B. Widener II and his cousin George Dunton Widener Jr. were named co-executors of Joseph's will. The estate was placed in trust, with equal shares going to Joseph's two children. But the question remained, what would happen to Lynwood Hall? Chapter 8. The Abandonment. In 1944, just 1 year after Joseph Early Widener's death, the contents of Lynwood Hall were auctioned off. This wasn't a distress sale. The Widener heirs were still immensely wealthy. Peter A.B. Widener, too, had inherited millions. George Dunton Widener Jr. had his own fortune from horse breeding. Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr., grandson of Eleanor Widener, was the heir to both the Widener and Elkins fortunes. They could have maintained Lynwood Hall. They had the money, but they chose not to. The auction was covered in Life magazine. Journalists described furniture, tapestries, chandeliers, porcelain, everything that hadn't already been donated to the National Gallery, being sold to the highest bidder. Pieces from Louis XV's palace, Renaissance bronzes, antique panels from European hunting lodges, all dispersed. For the first time in its history, Lynwood Hall stood empty. The family hired a caretaker to watch over the vacant mansion. The gardens were maintained, the structure was protected, but no one lived there. The 110 rooms echoed with silence. Why did the family abandon it? Part of the answer was practical. Lynwood Hall required a staff of 100 servants to operate properly. By the 1940s, that level of staffing was nearly impossible. Domestic service was no longer an accepted career path. Young people wanted factory jobs, office work, opportunities for advancement. The servant class that had made Gilded Age estates possible was disappearing. Taxes were another issue. The federal income tax had been modest when Lynwood Hall was built. By the 1940s, it was significant. Estate taxes meant that passing large properties to the next generation would trigger enormous tax bills. It was financially smarter to dispose of the property than to keep it. But the deeper answer was emotional. Lynwood Hall had been Peter A.B. Widener's dream. It had been built as a celebration of his success, as proof that a butcher's boy could create something magnificent. After the Titanic, it became a memorial to tragedy. Peter II had called it a mausoleum in his autobiography. He wasn't wrong. The mansion represented everything the Widener family had lost. George and Harry had lived there. They'd walked those halls, slept in those bedrooms, dined in that ballroom. After 1912, every room held ghosts. Joseph had kept the estate running out of duty to his father, but once Joseph died, there was no one left who felt that obligation. Peter II was focused on his own life, his own family, his own interests. He didn't want to be the custodian of a mausoleum. George Dunton Widener Jr. lived at Erdenheim Farm, his own estate. He was building his own legacy through horse breeding. He didn't need Lynwood Hall. The younger generation, Peter II's children, George Jr.'s nieces and nephews, Eleanor Dixon's children, had never really lived at Lynwood Hall. They'd visited, but it wasn't their home. They felt no connection to it. In 1944, the same year the contents were auctioned, a Philadelphia developer purchased the 220-acre farm that had been part of the original Lynwood estate. The developer built a housing community called Lynwood Gardens, suburban homes for middle-class families. The farm where Peter Widener had raised thoroughbreds became a subdivision. Lynwood Hall itself, the mansion and the remaining grounds, went on the market. The asking price was never publicly disclosed. But no buyer emerged. None of the Widener heirs wanted it. No one from Philadelphia's wealthy families wanted it. It was too large, too expensive, too impractical. The mansion sat empty for years. The caretaker maintained basic security, but the building began to deteriorate. Rain leaked through the roof. Plaster cracked, paint peeled. The ornamental gardens grew wild. In 1948, Peter Errol Brown Widener II died at Lankenau Hospital in Philadelphia. He was 52 years old. The cause of death was a rheumatic heart condition, likely related to childhood pneumonia. He left his racing farm to his son, Peter Errol Brown Widener III, and created trust funds for his wife and daughter. In 1952, Faith Theological Seminary purchased Lynwood Hall for $192,000. The seminary was a conservative Christian institution headed by Carl McIntyre. They needed facilities to train ministers and religious leaders. Lynwood Hall, with its 110 rooms, seemed perfect. Dormitories, classrooms, chapel space, administrative offices. The seminary could house hundreds of students on the estate. The Widener family was relieved. At least the building would be used. At least it wouldn't be demolished. Faith Theological Seminary operated at Lynwood Hall for over 40 years. They trained ministers who went on to lead churches across America and abroad. The ballroom, where Philadelphia's elite had once danced, became a chapel. The art gallery became a classroom. The family apartments became dormitories. The transformation was jarring. Horace Trumbauer's neoclassical masterpiece, designed to showcase Renaissance paintings and host lavish parties, now housed theology students studying Scripture. The wine cellars were empty. The stables were converted. The polo field disappeared under grass. But the seminary at least maintained the building. They kept the roof repaired, they heated the rooms, they used the space. Lynwood Hall was no longer a private treasure house. But it was still functioning. The seminary students were aware they were living in something extraordinary. The building's scale was overwhelming. The ballroom ceiling with its 16th century murals, the grand staircase, the ornate moldings. Even stripped of furnishings, Lynwood Hall retained its grandeur. But the seminary struggled financially. Running an institution of higher education is expensive. Running that institution in a mansion designed for Gilded Age millionaires is even more expensive. The heating bills alone were staggering. The electrical systems needed constant maintenance. The plumbing was old. The roof needed repair. By the 1980s, Faith Theological Seminary was in serious financial trouble. Enrollment was declining. Donations weren't keeping pace with expenses. They needed money. So they began selling pieces of Lynwood Hall itself. Interior features were removed and sold. Wood paneling was torn out. Fixtures were stripped. A French bronze fountain from the gardens was sold to a collector. Anything with value was liquidated to keep the seminary operating. This was heartbreaking for anyone who cared about architectural preservation. Lynwood Hall was being cannibalized. The building that had survived 40 years of vacancy after the Widener family left was now being destroyed from within by the organization that was supposed to be protecting it. In the late 1990s, Faith Theological Seminary finally gave up. They couldn't afford to maintain Lynwood Hall anymore. They abandoned the property. For the second time in its history, Lynwood Hall stood empty. But this time there was no caretaker, no maintenance. The seminary had stripped many of the building's valuable elements. What remained was exposed to the elements. Rain came through holes in the roof, water damaged plaster, mold grew in the damp rooms. Vandals broke in and spray-painted graffiti on the walls. Homeless people sought shelter in the vast, unheated spaces. Lynwood Hall, once called, quote, 11, was becoming a ruin. In 1996, Dr. Richard Yoon of the First Korean Church of New York purchased Lynwood Hall. Dr. Yoon had attended Faith Theological Seminary years earlier and operated a church. His intention was to use the mansion for religious purposes, but zoning regulations prevented him from operating a church at the location. The building sat vacant, owned by Dr. Yoon, but unused. He couldn't sell it easily because of its size and condition. He couldn't afford to renovate it. He couldn't legally use it for his intended purpose. Lynwood Hall remained empty, locked behind gates, deteriorating, becoming more damaged each year. In 2003, Lynwood Hall was added to the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia's list of endangered buildings. Preservationists sounded alarms. This was one of the most important Gilded Age mansions in America. It needed to be saved. But saved by whom? And for what purpose? The Widener heirs had no interest. They'd walked away decades ago. The fortune was still intact, spread across various trusts and inheritances. George Dunton Widener Jr. had died in 1971, leaving his entire estate to his nephew, Fitz-Eugene Dixon Jr. Fitz-Eugene Dixon Jr. died in 2006, leaving his fortune to various charitable causes. The Widener name continued through Widener University in Chester, Pennsylvania, but the family's connection to Lynwood Hall was severed. No one wanted to take responsibility for a 110-room mansion that needed tens of millions of dollars in repairs. Lynwood Hall sat behind its iron gates. Visible from the street, but inaccessible. Photographers sneaked onto the property to document the decay. Graffiti covered interior walls, debris littered floors. Animals nested in abandoned rooms. The mansion that Peter A.B. Widener built to prove he belonged among America's elite was dying a slow death, abandoned by the family who could have saved it. Chapter 10. The Heirs Who Vanished. The Widener family didn't disappear through financial ruin. They disappeared through choice. Generation by generation, they walked away from Lynwood Hall even though they had the wealth to maintain it. Understanding why requires looking at each heir individually. George Dunton Widener Jr. was 23 years old when his father and brother died on the Titanic. He'd been groomed to join the family business, to eventually take over the streetcar companies and investments his grandfather and father had built. Instead, tragedy thrust him into responsibility before he was ready. George Jr. lived at Lynwood Hall with his mother Eleanor and sister Eleanor after the Titanic, but he found the mansion oppressive. Every room reminded him of his father, the dining table where they'd shared meals, the smoking room where they'd discussed business, the library where his brother Harry had kept his book collection. The constant reminders made grief inescapable. George Jr. threw himself into thoroughbred horse breeding. His uncle Joseph had established breeding operations on portions of the Lynwood estate, and George Jr. decided to follow that path. In 1916, when he was only 27 years old, he purchased Erdenheim Farm in Whitemarsh Township, Pennsylvania. The farm encompassed 500 acres. George Jr. built it into one of the premier thoroughbred breeding operations in America. Erdenheim Farm became George Jr.'s obsession. He bred champion horses. He won major races. He became involved in racing administration, eventually serving as chairman of the Jockey Club for 14 years. Horse racing gave George Jr. what Lynwood Hall couldn't, a purpose disconnected from tragedy. In 1917, George Jr. married Jessie Sloan Dodge, a divorcee and daughter of New York millionaire Henry T. Sloan. This was scandalous at the time, a Widener marrying a divorced woman. But George Jr. didn't care about scandal. Jessie shared his passion for horses. They were partners in breeding operations, not just a society couple. The marriage worked because it was built on shared interests rather than social expectations. George Jr. and Jessie had no children of their own, though Jessie had a daughter from her previous marriage. This meant George Jr. was the last male Widener of his generation. When he died, the direct Widener line through Peter A.B. Widener's elder son would end. George Jr. bred 102 stakes winners during his career. His horses won the Travers Stakes 5 times. His colt Jaipur won the Belmont Stakes in 1962, a victory that thrilled George Jr. He was, by all accounts, happy with his life. He'd found meaning in breeding horses, in racing, in building something separate from his grandfather's and father's legacies. But George Jr. had no interest in Lynwood Hall. He'd inherited part of the family fortune when his uncle Joseph died in 1943. He could have restored the mansion. He could have made it a showplace again. He chose not to. Why? Because Lynwood Hall represented death. His father had lived there. His brother had lived there. They'd both died on the Titanic. The mansion was a memorial to loss, not a home. George Jr. preferred Erdenheim Farm, a place he'd built himself, where memories were his own creation. George Dunton Widener Jr. died on December 8, 1971, at Erdenheim Farm. He was 82 years old. He'd never married after Jessie died in 1968. He had no children. He left his entire estate, including Erdenheim Farm and control of the Widener Foundation, to his nephew, Fitz Eugene Dixon, Jr. George Jr. had been one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania. He could have saved Lynwood Hall. He didn't want to. Eleanor Widener Dixon, George Jr.'s sister, survived the Titanic, but never escaped its shadow. She'd lost her father and brother when she was 21 years old. Her wedding, which should have been joyous, was held in grief. She married Fitz Eugene Dixon Sr. in June 1912 and tried to build a normal life. Eleanor and Fitz had 2 children, a daughter also named Eleanor Widener Dixon, and a son, Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr. They built Ronayel Manor in Elkins Park, a magnificent 60-room Tudor Revival mansion, designed by Horace Trumbauer. The name Ronayel was Eleanor spelled backward, a private reference that showed Eleanor was trying to create her own identity separate from being a Titanic survivor. Ronayel Manor was deliberately designed to be less palatial than Lynwood Hall, but equally impressive in its own right, as Eleanor said. It was beautiful. Antique wood paneling from English estates, furniture from historical collections, gardens and grounds that rivaled any estate in Pennsylvania. But it was Eleanor's creation, not her grandfather's. Eleanor and Fitz divorced in 1936, after 24 years of marriage. Divorce was still uncommon among wealthy families, another indication that Eleanor was willing to break with convention. She remained at Ronayel Manor with her children, maintaining the estate until 1949, when she purchased Homewood, a mansion in Chestnut Hill. Eleanor devoted herself to philanthropy. She donated to Abington Memorial Hospital, where she served as a trustee. She founded the Maine Coast Memorial Hospital in Ellsworth, Maine. She supported bird preservation efforts. During World War II, she donated her yacht, also named Ronayel, to the U.S. Navy for service. The yacht was commissioned as USS Alabaster. In 1958, Eleanor and her brother George Jr. made a joint donation of $250,000 to endow Harvard's Widener Library, ensuring Harry's memorial would be maintained. It was their way of honoring the brother they'd lost. Eleanor died on February 12, 1966, in her Chestnut Hill home. She was 74 years old. She'd outlived her father and brother by 54 years, but she never forgot them. Her funeral was held at St. Paul's Church, where the Tiffany windows memorializing George and Harry still caught the light. Eleanor had no connection to Lynwood Hall after her mother remarried and moved out in 1915. The mansion wasn't her home. It was the place where her family had lived before the Titanic shattered everything. Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr., Eleanor's son, inherited the combined Widener and Elkins fortunes when his uncle George Jr. died in 1971. This made Fitz one of the wealthiest men in America. Conservative estimates put his inheritance at $150 million. Some said it was closer to $400 million. Fitz was born on August 14, 1923, at Winter Harbor, Maine, where the family spent summers. He grew up primarily at Ronayel Manor after his parents divorced. He attended Episcopal Academy and then Harvard, maintaining the family's educational tradition. After Harvard, Fitz returned to Episcopal Academy as a teacher. He taught English and French. He coached squash, tennis, and lightweight football. He served as director of athletics and assistant to the headmaster. He could have lived a life of leisure. His trust funds provided more than enough income. Instead, he chose to work as a teacher at a private school. It was an unusual choice for someone born into extreme wealth. When Fitz inherited his uncle's fortune in 1971, he didn't retire. He took over management of the Widener Foundation and devoted himself to philanthropy and education. He served as chairman of Widener University, Lafayette College, Temple University. He was involved with multiple hospitals, museums, and charitable organizations. He owned sports teams, the Philadelphia 76ers and a share of the Philadelphia Flyers. Not for profit, but because he loved sports and wanted to support Philadelphia teams. Fitz was generous, but not ostentatious. He lived at Erdenheim Farm after inheriting it, maintaining the property but not expanding it into something grander. He didn't build new mansions or buy additional estates. He focused on giving money away rather than accumulating more. But Fitz had no interest in Lynwood Hall. He'd visited it as a child, but it wasn't his home. His great-grandfather had built it. That was 3 generations removed. Fitz felt no obligation to preserve a building he'd never lived in. Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr. died on August 2, 2006. He was 82 years old. He left his fortune to his children and to various charitable causes. The Widener Foundation continued its work, but Lynwood Hall received nothing. Peter Arell Brown Widener II, Joseph's son, represented another branch of the family. He was born in 1895 and grew up at Lynwood Hall during its peak years. He witnessed the Titanic tragedy when he was 16 years old. He saw his grandfather Peter break from grief. He watched his father Joseph struggle to hold everything together. Peter II served in World War I, an experience that profoundly affected him. He enlisted despite physical disqualifications and served in France in a medical unit. He saw wounded soldiers. He witnessed death on an industrial scale. The war taught him that privilege didn't protect anyone from suffering. When Peter II returned, he married and lived in the converted stables at Lynwood Hall. But he was restless. In 1940, he published Without Drums, his autobiography. The book's title came from a quotation, quote, 15. In the book, Peter II was brutally honest about his feelings about Lynwood Hall. He called it, quote, 16. He wrote, quote, 17. These weren't nostalgic memories. They were a eulogy for a world he was glad to see die. Peter II believed the Gilded Age had been fundamentally unjust. Extreme wealth existing alongside extreme poverty. Grand mansions while workers lived in tenements. Art collections worth millions while children went hungry. The war had shown him that this system was unsustainable. It had to end. Peter II's solution was to give away the art collection. He announced in his book that the Widener collection would go to the National Gallery of Art. Not sold, donated, given to the American people. His father Joseph agreed. In 1942, the transfer was finalized. Peter II died in 1948 at only 52 years old. Of a rheumatic heart condition. He'd seen his father donate the art collection, but didn't live to see what would happen to Lynwood Hall itself. Perhaps that was merciful. Peter II's son, Peter Arell Brown Widener III, inherited racing operations and a portion of the family fortune. He attended the University of Kentucky and was forced to leave when his father died, taking over management of family businesses. Peter III lived until 1999. Like the others, he had no interest in Lynwood Hall. It was his great-grandfather's creation, not his. The pattern repeated across every branch of the family. Josephine. Quote 18. Widener, Joseph's daughter, married and moved to Europe. Her descendants lived abroad, disconnected from Philadelphia entirely. The grandchildren of George Dunton Widener Sr., the children of Eleanor Dixon, grew up in their own world, with their own interests. Lynwood Hall was just a building their great-grandfather had built. Each generation had their own lives, their own passions, their own definitions of success. George Jr. found meaning in horse breeding. Eleanor Dixon found it in philanthropy. Fitz Dixon Jr. found it in education and sports team ownership. Peter II found it in rejecting the Gilded Age entirely. Peter III found it in managing businesses. None of them found meaning in maintaining a 110-room mansion built by a man they'd never known or barely remembered. The wealth was still there. The Widener fortune, spread across trusts and investments, remained substantial. Current estimates suggest the various Widener descendants collectively control hundreds of millions of dollars, possibly over $1 billion. The money didn't disappear, but the connection to Lynwood Hall did. The mansion represented a specific moment in American history, the Gilded Age, when industrial fortunes created European-style aristocracy. That moment had passed. The social structures that made Lynwood Hall possible collapsed. Domestic service became unacceptable. Extreme displays of wealth became embarrassing rather than impressive. Estate taxes made passing large properties to heirs financially destructive. The heirs made rational decisions. They sold off pieces of the estate. They liquidated assets. They invested in income-producing businesses. They supported causes they cared about. They lived comfortable, but not ostentatious lives. But in doing so, they abandoned the physical symbol of Peter A.B. Widener's achievement, the mansion that was supposed to endure for centuries, barely lasted 50 years as a family home. The Widener family vanished from society, not because they lost their money, but because they chose to. They walked away from the world the Titanic had shattered. They couldn't heal the wound, so they left it behind. And Lynwood Hall, the monument to everything Peter had built, was left to decay. Chapter 11. The Art in Washington. In 1942, Joseph Early Widener donated the family's art collection to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The donation was announced in Peter A.B. Widener II's autobiography, Without Drums, published that same year. The transfer included more than 100 paintings, along with sculptures, tapestries, porcelains, furniture, and other decorative arts. The collection was valued between $19 and $50 million, depending on the appraisal method. Conservative estimates put it at over $500 million in today's dollars. The 14 Rembrandts in the Widener collection became the core of the National Gallery's Rembrandt holdings. Works like Vermeer's Quote 20 and Raphael's The Alba Madonna became highlights of the museum's collection. Paintings by Van Dyck, Titian, El Greco, and others filled entire galleries. The National Gallery designated specific rooms as Quote 22, quote maintaining the family name in perpetuity. Visitors to the museum today still see these designations. The Widener collection didn't disappear. It was preserved and made accessible to millions of people who would never have seen it at Lynwood Hall. This was exactly what Peter A.B. Widener had wanted, though he might not have known it during his lifetime. He'd been conflicted about the ultimate fate of his collection. Should it stay with the family? Should it go to a museum? He'd struggled with the question. Joseph made the decision for him. And in doing so, Joseph fulfilled the highest purpose of great art, sharing it with the world. There's an interesting contrast here. The Widener family abandoned Lynwood Hall, the physical structure, the mansion, the estate, but they preserved the art collection. They ensured that Peter's greatest achievement, his carefully curated masterpieces, would survive. Perhaps they understood, consciously or not, that the art was what mattered. The building was just stones and wood. Beautiful, yes. Architecturally significant, absolutely, but ultimately replaceable. The paintings, though, those were irreplaceable. A Rembrandt painted in the 1600s, a Raphael from the Italian Renaissance. These works couldn't be rebuilt or restored if they were lost. They had to be protected. The Widener family chose to protect the art and abandon the building. It was a choice that revealed their priorities. Preserving beauty mattered. Maintaining a symbol of their own status did not. Today, the Widener collection at the National Gallery of Art is one of the museum's greatest treasures. Millions of people have seen these paintings. Students study them. Scholars write about them. The art that Peter A.B. Widener collected to prove his cultural sophistication now belongs to everyone. Meanwhile, Lynwood Hall slowly crumbled in Elkins Park. The mansion that was supposed to be eternal lasted barely 50 years as a family home. The art collection that Peter thought might be dispersed has remained together for over 80 years, intact and accessible. It's a strange irony, but perhaps it's also fitting. Peter A.B. Widener started as a butcher's boy and became a titan of industry. He built a mansion to prove he'd arrived. But his real legacy wasn't the building. It was the beauty he preserved and passed on. The mansion could fall. The art endures. Chapter 12. The restoration. For decades, Lynwood Hall seemed doomed. The building deteriorated year by year. Preservationists made desperate appeals. Architectural historians documented the decay. But no one with the resources to save it stepped forward. The family was gone. The Widener heirs had moved on. They supported universities, museums, hospitals, but not Lynwood Hall. The mansion that had been built as a monument to their great-grandfather's success had become an embarrassment, a relic no one wanted. Dr. Richard Yoon owned the property but couldn't afford to restore it. Restoration estimates ranged from $30 to $50 million. The building needed a new roof, updated electrical and plumbing systems, structural repairs, historic preservation work. It would require years of labor and an enormous budget. In 2014, Lynwood Hall was listed for sale at $16 million. Later, the price was reduced to $11 million. Even at that price, no buyers emerged. The mansion was simply too large, too damaged, too expensive to fix. Then, in 2022, something changed. A group of preservationists, historians, and philanthropists formed the Lynwood Hall Preservation Foundation. Their goal was to acquire the property, restore it, and open it to the public. Not as a private residence, that era was over, but as a museum, event space, and historic site. The foundation raised money through donations, grants, and public support. They made a persuasive case. Lynwood Hall is one of the most important Gilded Age mansions in America. It's the work of Horace Trumbauer, one of the great architects of that era. It once housed one of the finest private art collections in the world. It deserves to be saved. On February 8, 2023, the Lynwood Hall Preservation Foundation announced they had reached a purchase agreement. On June 27, 2023, the sale was finalized. The foundation purchased Lynwood Hall for $9 million. Restoration began immediately. Contractors stabilized the structure. Roofers repaired leaks. Electricians updated wiring. Preservationists worked on historic features, carefully restoring moldings, paneling, and architectural details. The foundation's plan is comprehensive. Phase 1 focuses on the structure and gardens. Phase 2 will restore the interiors. Phase 3 will add modern amenities, climate control, accessibility features, spaces for events and exhibitions. The estimated cost is over $40 million. It will take years. But for the first time since the Widener family left in 1944, Lynwood Hall has a future. The foundation plans to open the gardens to the public as a park. The mansion will host exhibitions, educational programs, and special events. Eventually, portions of the house will be open for tours, allowing visitors to see the spaces where the Wideners lived. It won't be the same as it was in 1900, when Peter A.B. Widener walked through galleries filled with Rembrandts. The art is gone, donated to the National Gallery. The furnishings were sold. The family is gone, but the building will endure. And perhaps that's enough. Lynwood Hall represents a specific moment in American history, the Gilded Age, an era when industrial fortunes created vast inequality, when millionaires built mansions that rivaled European palaces, when art collections assembled by American tycoons became some of the finest in the world. It also represents the fragility of those achievements. Peter A.B. Widener spent decades building his fortune and his collection. He created something magnificent. But one tragedy, one ship sinking in the North Atlantic, shattered everything. The family never recovered. The mansion became a tomb for memories too painful to bear. The Widener story is uniquely American, the immigrant family that climbs from poverty to unimaginable wealth, the self-made man who proves himself through achievement, the fortune that lasts for generations. But it's also a story about the limits of money. Wealth couldn't save George and Harry from the Titanic. Wealth couldn't heal Peter's grief. Wealth couldn't make the next generation want to maintain the estate. In the end, the family walked away. And for 80 years, Lynwood Hall stood as a monument to what they'd lost. Now, finally, it has a chance to become something else. Not a private treasure house, not a mausoleum, but a public space where people can learn about the Gilded Age, about the Widener family, about American history. The butcher's boy from a German immigrant family built something that will outlast his descendants. Lynwood Hall will endure, not as a home, but as a testament to ambition, tragedy, and the strange ways history survives. If you visit Elkins Park, Pennsylvania today, you can see Lynwood Hall from the street. The iron gates are closed. The mansion sits on a hill, visible through the trees. It looks haunted. In a sense, it is. Peter A.B. Widener died in 1915, believing he'd created something that would last forever. Joseph Early Widener died in 1943, knowing the era had ended. Peter II wrote in 1940 that, quote, 23, quote, they were right. Lynwood Hall couldn't survive as a private residence. The social structures that made it possible disappeared. The servant class that staffed it vanished. The cultural assumption that extreme wealth should be displayed in palatial homes dissolved. The family that built it couldn't bear to keep it. The tragedy that defined them made the mansion unlivable. But the building survives. Not in the way Peter imagined, not as the Widener family home passing from generation to generation. Instead, it's becoming something public. A museum, a park, a place where anyone can walk through the rooms where Philadelphia's wealthiest family once lived. The Wideners vanished from society slowly, one generation at a time. They didn't lose their money. They lost their connection to the world that wealth had built for them. The Titanic created a wound that never healed. Every subsequent generation moved a little further from Lynwood Hall, a little further from the past, a little further from the grief. By the time George Dunton Widener Jr. died in 1971, the last Widener who'd actually lived at the mansion was gone. By the time Fitzeugene Dixon Jr. died in 2006, even the grandchildren who'd visited as children were gone. The connection was severed completely. There's something profound in this disappearance. The Wideners didn't fail. They succeeded beyond Peter's wildest dreams. They remained wealthy. They led influential lives. George Jr. became a legend in horse racing. Fitz Dixon Jr. became one of Pennsylvania's most important philanthropists. The family thrived. But they thrived by walking away from what Peter had built. They understood, perhaps unconsciously, that Lynwood Hall represented a world that had caused them unbearable pain. Peter's ambition had driven him to invest in the Titanic. That investment killed George and Harry. The mansion built to celebrate the family's success became inseparable from the family's greatest tragedy. Each generation made a choice. They could preserve Lynwood Hall and live with those memories, or they could walk away and build their own lives. They walked away, and in walking away, they demonstrated something important. Wealth can't force healing. Money can't compel connection. Property doesn't create obligation. The art collection that Peter and Joseph assembled still hangs in the National Gallery of Art. Millions of people have seen those Rembrandts, that Vermeer, that Raphael Madonna. The beauty Peter preserved outlived him by over a century. It will outlive all of us. Students at Harvard study in the Widener Library, surrounded by Harry's book collection. Patients receive care at hospitals the Wideners funded. Churches preserve the Tiffany windows Peter commissioned. The family's charitable legacy endures in institutions across Pennsylvania and beyond. But Lynwood Hall nearly crumbled. For decades, it sat empty. Rain leaked through the roof. Plaster fell from ceilings. Graffiti covered walls. The seminary that tried to use its stripped-out fixtures to sell. The building that was supposed to be permanent almost disappeared. The Lynwood Hall Preservation Foundation's acquisition in 2023 gives the mansion a second chance. Not as a private home. That era is truly over. But as a public space where people can learn about the Gilded Age, about the Widener family, about American history. The restoration will cost over $40 million. It will take years, but the mansion will survive. There's poetry in this outcome. Peter built Lynwood Hall for his family. The family abandoned it. Now it will belong to everyone. The private treasure house becomes a public monument. The symbol of exclusivity becomes a space for inclusion. Peter wouldn't have wanted this. He built Lynwood Hall to prove he belonged among America's elite. Opening it to the public would have contradicted that purpose. But Peter didn't get to decide. His death in 1915 ended his control. His descendants made their own choices. And perhaps this is the real lesson of Lynwood Hall. Nothing is permanent, not wealth, not family, not buildings, not even grief, though grief can last longer than stone. Peter started as a butcher's boy and became a titan. He built an empire, accumulated a fortune, constructed a palace. The Titanic took his son and grandson, and everything unraveled over decades. The family dispersed, the mansion emptied, the fortune fragmented across trusts and inheritances. But the paintings Peter loved, those remain. Not at Lynwood Hall, not in private hands, in a museum, accessible to everyone, preserved forever. The Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library stands at Harvard, serving scholars, honoring a young man's passion. St. Paul's Church displays the Tiffany windows, catching light, remembering the dead. These are the pieces that endured. Not the private spaces, but the public gifts. Not the mansion closed to outsiders, but the museum open to all. Not the family's isolation, but their contributions to the world. The Widener family disappeared from society, but their greatest achievement was shared with that society. The art, the library, the churches, the hospitals, the institutions. These outlasted the mansion. These outlasted the family name. These became part of America's cultural inheritance. Lynwood Hall stands as a reminder of both what was built and what was lost. Peter's ambition created something magnificent. The Titanic destroyed it. The family walked away. But now, finally, the mansion will be opened so others can learn that story. So others can understand what the Gilded Age built and why it couldn't last. If this video gave you a new perspective on Gilded Age history and the families who shaped it, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into forgotten stories. Share this with anyone fascinated by America's grand estates and the dark secrets they hold. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.